What's up, my friends? Great to be with you here on the Challenging Conversation Show, brought to you by the Edified Podcast Network, powered by the Christian Post. I am your host, Jason Jimenez, and it's my prayer that this show will help you stand strong in your faith as you seek to have challenging conversations with people of a different worldview than your own. Today, I have back on the show Neil Shenvi. On our last episode, Neil and I had a very stimulating discussion on CRT, and Neil shared some specific issues regarding CRT, including some dangers that Christians need to be aware of and how they can rationally and relationally respond to the ideology of CRT. Now, there was so much that Neil and I weren't able to get to, so in this episode, we'll be addressing the topic of anti-racism. So this is almost like a part two from our previous episode. So if you missed that episode, make sure you check that out wherever you get your podcasts. Now, in many church circles, you will hear Christian leaders say that it's not enough to be against racism. They say you need to be an anti-racist. Now, what does that actually mean when people say you need to be an anti-racist? And more importantly, is anti-racism, according to how progressives and others who define it that way, is it biblical? So, Neil, I'd like to welcome you back on the show and ask you this question. Are you ready for round two and get into anti-racism?
I'm ready. All right, hit me with it.
I'll say, if people checked out the last episode, you did a great job breaking down issues of CRT, because one thing I'm finding is not that people are challenging why CRT is wrong, but they're just confused about all of the different definitions and spokespeople, you know what I mean? And so hopefully that was informative to people. But you and I know in this conversation with CRT, inevitably it leads to this discussion because it's embedded in CRT of anti-racism. So right off the bat, because you and I know when it comes to discussion with somebody of a different worldview, you have to define your terms. And I remember studying philosophy way back when, and I remember my professors all the time, we were always constantly defining terms as we were building argumentations and syllogisms. So in a nutshell, what is anti-racism?
Okay, one sentence. Anti-racism means active opposition to racism and an active commitment dismantling the systems and structures that perpetuate it. So it's very concise, but here's the key point. Yes, you have to define your terms. So listen, when they talk about racism in that definition, they're not talking just about interpersonal relationships, like, oh, you don't like people of a different race. That's not what they mean. It's why it talks about systems and structures. Yeah. Because baked into that very notion of anti-racism is the idea that racism is systemic, not just interpersonal. We'll get to this later. And the other big part of it, when you talk about systemic or structural racism, is this idea of intersectionality, which we mentioned on the last show, that there are all these interlocking systems of oppression, including racism, but also including sexism, classism, ableism, cisgenderism, heterosexism, etc. And they all need to be taken apart in order to truly lead to liberation for all people. So that's really, and so, you know, sometimes people do use the word anti-racist, and they simply mean opposing racism.
Right.
And but what dominates our discussion today in the culture, you'll see in books that talk about anti-racism, they generally adopt this definition, not just merely being opposed personally to racism, but doing the work to actively dismantle the systems that perpetuate racism.
So let me ask you, in that definition, and it's very good, one thing I like about Neil, you guys, is he's very concise, he's done his homework, and that's important. So hopefully that encourages people out there listening to do the same. If somebody like a pastor, we have many pastors who listen to this program, if they say that they use the phrase anti-racism, like, hey, as Christians, you know, the Bible's against racism, therefore we are to be an anti-racist. And you and I know what they mean, okay? They're trying to be not just logical, but consistent biblically. But in today's culture, and we talked about in the last episode about when they hijack or redefine terms, would you advise in today's culture, would you advise pastors specifically to be using the term anti-racism?
Yeah, I would advise against it, because it will be, exactly. if they really understand how it's being defined popularly, not uniformly, but often popularly, it brings in a lot of other baggage they would not want to endorse. In the same way, A pastor might say, I am very much pro reproductive freedom. Why? Because I think a woman should have a right to choose to have a kid if she wants to. That's freedom, reproductive freedom. Say, no, time out. That's not what that phrase means to the 99% of your hearers. So if you use that phrase and just assume it has some shared meaning, that's very dangerous. In the same way, people want to be hip and trendy, so they throw out these terms like privilege and anti-racism. I say, just hold on. You want to be clear. Your primary duty as a communicator is to be clear in your meaning. And using words like anti-racism will often at least be confusing, if not outright misleading. So I would just say, no, if you want to say I'm opposed to racism, say I'm opposed to racism. If you want to say we want to oppose inter-ethnic hatred, great, say that. But that phrase often has a lot of baggage.
And I will say too, there was an individual, I won't mention his name, very well-known celebrity pastor, author, runs big Christian events, and he was on a live streaming with two other individuals. And this is an example that I actually give with a lot of pastors, Neil, and I appreciate what you just shared, because I agree. The same is, if the culture uses it one way, you can't try to redefine it on your own when most of the population, I'm not saying that the Webster Dictionary has taken on that definition and therefore it's stamped and approved, universally. But when you're trying to turn something that the culture already understands to be have a different meaning, and so, like, for example, this one pastor says, instead of saying white privilege, I like to say white blessing. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and it just blew up in his face, right? Yeah. And I use that as an example because you would think that individual, under the training that they've been through, the amount of staff and intention they put into outreach, that they would know better than that. But sadly, and you and I are seeing this more and more now, it's becoming the norm, that people don't know any better. They're not getting the proper training, critical, thinking critically through things, right? And so he was taking something that the culture has already been using in association with, like you said, oppressed groups.
Right.
And he was trying to gospelize, to Christianize it. Right. And it flew in his face. And that's just not something we should be doing at all. Okay, right. Just because they have ownership of anti-racism doesn't mean we as a church need to try to, change it back to something like this, the whole Halloween thing. Remember when they're playing that game centuries ago. So I agree with you that we have to be careful. And so just people listening right now, if you've been trying to use it in a way, like you said, it's already been defined a certain way, and you don't want people to be thinking then you support something that's anti-Christian. So the next thing that leads into this discussion on anti-racism then is you and I know there's a huge advancement of people from what we talked about in the previous podcast about CRT to currently this issue regarding anti-racism. When I say issue, I'm not taking it lightly. But is there systemic racism in the United States today? Is it real? And if so, why?
So it depends on how you define it. Right. So this is the key point. People will say, does it? So when people ask you, does systemic racism exist today? I'd say, what do you mean? I don't say yes or no. I say, what do you mean by systemic racism? Define it for me. Now, if you look, I looked at a lot of scholarly sources. I looked at popular sources. And if you look at those sources, they generally say the same thing. I'm going to quote from Kendi from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was super popular. #1, #2 bestseller last summer. So I'll quote from him. What he's saying is very much of a popular understanding. So listen to his statement. He says, a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity. Now, he defines inequity in the last paragraph as any kind of group differences. So a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity, meaning inequality, between racial groups. And racist policies have been described by other terms: institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. But these are vaguer terms in racist policy. So the bottom line is he's defining systemic racism to be synonymous with a policy that produces or sustains racial inequity, which he means as inequalities of outcome. It's in this book. Now people, and if you ask people, is that what you mean? Do you mean that there are these systems that either create or perpetuate racial inequality? Is that what you mean? Yes. So these people being evil and people being racist, it's that these systems that produce unfair outcomes, or unequal outcomes. And you say, well, is that what you mean? Yes. Well, do I believe that exists? Oh, of course it does.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the problem. Lots of good and just systems still sustain and perpetuate racial inequity. For example, marriage. I can show you data that marriage, there's a big interracial wealth gap between blacks and whites. Like 13 times more wealth is held by whites than by blacks, the median black families. Okay, 13 times, huge racial wealth gap. Well, what perpetuates that inequity? Well, one of the things that perpetuates inequity is marriage, because inheritance laws allow you to pass your wealth to your kids that you have. And more than that, we know that that whites have a higher marriage rate than blacks do, just demographically. So we know marriage actually generates wealth. Again, that's just sociology. So marriage itself is perpetuating racial inequities, and yet marriage is good and just. Another obvious one, there's a big racial wealth gap. You know how we get rid of that gap? Get rid of private property. So private property laws are perpetuating racial inequity. Does that make them racist? So the point is, you can find any number. Now you say, well, those are extreme. Yeah, okay, how about this? Standardized testing. Just in the last few months, a number of schools have gotten rid of standardized testing on the basis of what? Racial equity. Yep. Because there's a gap between white and black and Hispanic test scores. What do? Get rid of the tests and get equity. What about policing? Defund the police. That premise is, well, blacks are arrested at higher rates than whites, and whites are arrested at higher rates than Asians. So we get equity by getting rid of police, defunding the police, even abolishing the police. My only point is this. Do inequities exist? Yes. Do systems perpetuate those inequities? Yes. But are all of those systems necessarily racist? No. Some are, some may be, but you can't assume that everything is either racist or anti-racist like Kendi does. This is really false binary. Instead, we have to look at a case-by-case basis and say, is this system just and fair? And whether it produces racially disparate outcomes is sort of a separate question. Right. Okay. So that's my answer. Is that yes, it exists, but it's a bad definition.
Yeah. And again, see, that's what's hard, right, Neil? Is sometimes it's sad in the Christian circles, they're not critically thinking through that all the way, right? And so that hopefully that helped people in these conversations, because oftentimes, like right now, when we're talking about, hey, are you against racism? Of course. Okay, so you're an anti-racist. Well, I guess so, because it's got the term anti in front of it. But hopefully that helped people, work through this process of anti-racism. Now, you've mentioned him several times, and of course, I've had to put away his stuff because I was like too much engaged with Kendi's books. But overall, what is his message in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist? Now, I'm not advocating for people to go out there and buy the book or download it right away. Just give us the overall message of why. I know you can't speak for him, why he wrote the book, but what was the purpose of him writing it with with the big idea behind it?
I mean, he wants people to embrace an anti-racist identity.
Exactly.
Not just to do it on the side, but this is their identity now. And here's the thing. So I'd say there are, I think, four big big ideas in his book. Number one is there's no neutrality. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. So let me quote him, page 9. Quote, "There is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist." The claim of, and then he goes further, the claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. The language of colorblindness, like the language of not racist, is a mask to hide racism. So, black, white, binary, no pun intended. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. And that's why so many Christians want to be anti-racist. Who wants to be called a racist? Like, okay, you oppose I actually had people tell me, when they would say, when I critique critical race theory, they say, why don't you go ahead and just say it, that you're critiquing anti-racism. I'm kind of like thinking, well, actually I am. Then when I finally said, well, actually, I am critiquing this form of anti-racism, they're saying, we know that makes you an anti-racist. The short form of that is racist. I'm like, There you go. That's why people just say, fine, I'm an anti-racist.
Yeah.
And put their head down, because who wants to be called a racist?
Yeah. See, and sometimes it's the psychology behind it, right? It's the manipulation behind it. And it's so weird. And you and I, we could talk all day about the contradictions in Kendi's book. He says one thing and then he says another, but they're the ones that are putting people in these subgroups in order to label them in the first place when they're saying you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So we get all that. So there's another book he wrote before he wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, and you mentioned it before, called Stamped from the Beginning. And clearly there, Kendi writes that all racial disparities in the world come from racial discrimination.
That's my next statement. Yeah. So the next big point of his book is this: unequal. So once you're an anti-racist, what do you believe? Second point: unequal outcomes equals racial discrimination. So I'm going to quote from the book Stamped from the Beginning. Quote: "We have a hard time recognizing that racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and in the world at large. When you truly believe that the racial groups are equal, then you also believe that racial disparities must be the result of racial discrimination." And by the way, when he says sole cause, he means sole cause. In that book, Stamped from the Beginning, he has three classes of people. You have the segregationist racist. These are people that are openly racist, that think that the whites are better than blacks or blacks are better than whites. Those are segregationist racists. Then you have the assimilationists. People like, I kid you not, Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Booker T. Washington. These are assimilationist racists.
Yeah.
Because they believe that disparities are partially due to discrimination and partially due to something else. That makes you an assimilationist racist. The only non-racist in his world are the anti-racists who believe what he does, which is that every single disparity in the entire world that's racial is solely caused by racial discrimination. That's it. So again, you're either racist or you're anti-racist. If you're anti-racist, you believe the sole cause of disparities is discrimination. And by the way, if you're curious about that thesis, there's a book called Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell, who's a black economist, has a whole book on how that thesis is just empirically not true. I mean, think about it, guys. There are disparities between, say, countries in Asia and countries in Europe. They're racial disparities. Race is a social construct, but they're racial disparities. Is that because there's discrimination between, how, I don't know, Indonesia functions versus France? No, they're different countries, people. It just doesn't work at all. Anyway, but he believes that, and he says if you don't believe that, you're racist. So that's number two. Number three is interlocking oppressions, part of critical race theory as well. So you can't. I'll just quote him. I'll quote Kendi with no commentary. Page 159 of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalism policies. Anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. Page 189. To truly be anti-racist is to be feminist. To truly be feminist is to be anti-racist. And finally, page 197. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. So all of these oppressions are interlocking, and you cannot simply say, I'm going to be anti-racist by itself. You must also be a feminist. You must also be anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic. You have to recognize ableism and all these other oppressions and work to fight all of them at the same time. And again, that is a core tenet of critical race theory as well. That's not a new thing. That's going back to 1993 and the earliest founders of the CRT saying that. Finally, the last part of that book is he explicitly links his anti-racism to, in his words, religious strivings. So his parents were professing Christians, and he claims, I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but he claims that they became Christians at Urbana in 1970 at the Big Missions Conference, but then they were later saved, in his words, quote, saved into black liberation theology and joined the churchless church of the Black Power movement, reading the work of James Cone. But he said this, so he says on page 17, I cannot disconnect my parents' religious strivings to be Christian from my secular strivings to be an anti-racist. So when people some people either jokingly or disparagingly or earnestly compare anti-racism, critical race theory, wokeism to a religion. Well, you have Kendi here saying in complete sincerity that I find myself drawn to anti-racism and striving for that in the same way that my parents strove to follow Jesus. So look, I mean, I'll take him at his word. This is a deeply spiritual quest for him, and he really wants people who read his book to join him on that quest. Mm-hmm. So that make the hairs stand on end a little bit when people are like, "This needs to be your new identity." And again, other Christian authors use the same language. Yeah. Evangelical authors will talk about having their lives transformed by being born again into anti-racism. You can find that in books like Daniel Hill's Wide Awake, or David Swanson's Rediscipling the White Church, or Joseph Barnes' How to Be an Anti-Racist Church. They use that metaphor of going from blindness to sight, like the healing. They use the metaphor, the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. They use that as a metaphor for their journey to anti-racism. So that is a little bit disconcerting, I think, for most of us. But no, I mean, you really can't have two religions in a sense. And it sounds a lot like this is a religious thing for you. So anyway, I'm not overplaying that, but it's definitely there.
No, you're not. And that leads me to the next one, because even in some of this confusion, as you're laying out those four things from Kendi's perspective in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, so how would you then help the listener right now who's still wrestling through this and saying, okay, I get some of the stuff you're saying, Neil, and you're quoting this and you're quoting that, and it's kind of making a little sense. How do you boil it down and say, okay, guys, bottom line, this is how Kendi's book is anti-Christian or runs contrary to a biblical worldview?
I mean, the most obvious, unavoidable point is that critical race theory and anti-racism demand that you abandon a biblical sexual ethic. They demand it. He flatly says you cannot be homophobic or transphobic and be an anti-racist. Just right out there, right? And so you have to, you're either going to ignore him, and he wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But the point is, you're going to have to give away and give up on biblical sexual ethics when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to gender identity, in order to buy into his program, and in order to embrace the core defining elements of critical race theory as defined by their founders. It's not negotiable for them, all right? So I'm sorry. When people are like, we can kind of like, no, I think you can embrace critical race theory. I'm like, no, not the defining elements according to them. Anyway, so that's number one, very obvious. The number two is more empirical, but many people that are non-Christians, secular atheists, have pointed out that Kendi's this false binary between a racist policy and an anti-racist policy it's wrong. That not all disparities are caused by discrimination. Simple example, the ethnic group with the number one highest median income in the U.S. is Indian American. They have a median income over six figures. The median white household is $65,000, I think. So they have like 60% more income, Indian Americans do, than whites do. Is that disparity caused by discrimination? Well, of course not. There's no pro-Indian, I mean, I'm happy Indian. I've never experienced pro-Indian discrimination in my life. So I guess, I don't know, maybe I haven't, I don't know it. But the point is that
yeah, I'm gonna on this show. I'm gonna call you out right now, Neil, on your.
I know. I mean, I have Indian privilege. Maybe I do.
I have Indian privilege.
My only point is that, and this is not like, evangelical fundamentalists are saying, no, you have like Coleman Hughes, a black philosophy student, Glenn Lowry, a black economist at Brown University, John McWhorter, a linguist at Columbia, or NYU, I don't remember. But the point is, all of these people that are different worldviews, different religion, and yet saying, no, this is just a false statement. We can't look at disparities and say there's immediately therefore discrimination. Look at the NBA. NBA is say 60% players are black, maybe 80% even. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah. But no one thinks there's anti-white discrimination going on. It's just people have different interests sometimes. I mean, it could be discrimination. You can't assume that it is and call everyone a racist if they don't agree with you. Then the final point, and that's just, again, you're like, well, that's not a religious thing. Well, no, but it's a reality thing. You cannot buy into a view of reality that is false. In Christianity is opposed to false statements. So this is a pretty extreme and radical and comprehensive view of reality, and it's based on a fallacy. So you should reject it. Then finally, though, the reason he gets to that position, and it's built into his work thinking about the law and policy and culture, that Kendi, along with his critical race theorist allies, reject what's called proceduralism in terms of justice in favor of a collective group justice. So they don't see justice as something you really need to achieve primarily on the individual level, or at least not entirely. They also see that justice has to occur at a collective group level, right? And that can even require what we think was be injustice at an individual level in order to achieve group justice. For example, Kendi writes this statement: the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Okay, let me try to put that in a positive spin on that, okay? If I steal your wallet, Jason, I steal it, right? And then the police come and say, you have to return the wallet. And they take the wallet from you and give it to me. You can't say, hey, that's unjust. You took my wallet and gave it to Neil. They would say, no. That wallet's Neil's. You stole it. We're returning it. So on one hand, if he's using discrimination in that sense, it makes some sense that if you steal my wallet, it's not discrimination or injustice or theft to steal it back. I mean, it's not stealing at all. It's returning it. The problem is he applies that to these huge collective groups. For example, the classic example, it's going to be controversial, but affirmative action would say, at least on his view, not on everyone's view, but his view of affirmative action is this. In the past, blacks were discriminated against in college admission, among many other things. That is true. That is history, okay? But he would outright say the solution then is to discriminate against whites and non-blacks to make up for the past discrimination. He's just outright saying it, okay? He has a problem saying that, but I have a problem saying that. Two wrongs don't make it right. Now, it's one thing to say if you were denied admission, that admission should be given back to you. But it's another thing to say, well, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, some other random person that you don't even know, he was denied admission, therefore you get it today. That's at least complicated. It's not that simple. You're like saying, Jason, you stole my wallet. That's unjust. Therefore, I'm going to steal some other half-Mexican wallet and give it to me back, and now it'll be just now. That's not how things work. And here's a simple. Now, I understand that discussions of reparations, affirmative action, they're complicated, but Kendi simplifies it in a very dangerous way by saying, look, who cares? We'll just discriminate. That's fine. And I'm saying even if you support reparations, even if you support affirmative action, you can't support his reasoning, which is just outcomes matter and individual justice is not that important. He doesn't say that outright, but he does say really troubling things. And so I think Christians need to hold up the idea that justice does happen at an individual level. Of course, things like slavery, Jim Crow, the Black Codes, Japanese internment, Chinese Exclusion Act, these things were group injustices, yes, absolutely, but they still should be judged as they affected individuals. You can't punish random people who happen to be Japanese or happen to... Wait, isn't that the problem? Did we learn our lesson or not? We got into this mess because we treated people like, well, you're part of that group. I'll exclude them and be unjust to them because they're part of that group. And now we're going to make things right. We're doing exactly the same thing in the reverse. So again, we can have nuanced conversations about things like reparations. I don't think it's open and shut, frankly, but not the way he's conceptualizing it. That's the issue.
Yeah, I think that's really good. You know, that actually brings me to the next thing. It's something in response to what you said in an article called The Gospel of Anti-Racism, which is a short review of Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, because I think that's what we're trying to help the average Christian understand is how this stuff is, you know, that runs contrary to the Bible. And you say, quote, what's notably lacking from Kendi's anti-racism are the Christian concepts of sin, redemption, forgiveness, and grace, which, by the way, let me pause and say this to people listening to what Neil's responding to Kendi's books and stuff. You guys, that's what we need to look at theologically in Scripture, in bibliology, is look at what the Bible teaches about sin, redemption, forgiveness, and grace. You don't see any of that. Now, we're not saying Kendi is a Christian, like he was saying his parents are, that went into black, liberal theology. But we're saying for you as a Christian, that's what we believe. And so you have to interpret it through those lenses, not through what Kendi's saying. Neil, you go on to say, instead of seeing the fundamental problem as in here in our own hearts, lives, and choices, we see the fundamental problem as out there in systems of power constructed by self-interested policymakers. Instead of a salvation that comes from outside of us and is received as a gift, salvation is something that we accomplish as we struggle against the forces of racism, sexism, capitalism, homophobia, and transphobia, end quote. So in a nutshell, how would you then kind of settle this issue to the listener right now and saying, hey guys, I know things could be controversial. I know things could be confusing. I know you were saying earlier that Kendi is trying to convey, you're trying to give him benefit of the doubt. That's what I do with people. I don't see them as my enemy. I may oppose their point of view. I may critique their point of view, but I'm not going to criticize them as a person. And I'm going to say, hey, look, you believe this. I don't believe that. But I'm not going to fall prey to your definition of your point of view as you're trying to, drag people into this thing. So, you're in essence saying that, people as Christians have to see that Kendi, again, he doesn't claim to be a Christian. He's not a Christian. So we're not saying that. But they have to understand that this guy's anti-racist points of view are actually dangerous to some degree, correct?
Yeah, because it's not. So people will say, "Well, I adopt the Christian worldview, but I also want to be an anti-racist. I don't see I can just combine the two. I can, spiritually, theologically, I can be a Christian, a conservative Christian, but then I'll just also adopt all of Kendi's, policies and his way of thinking about racism." And I pointed out just off the bat, he won't let you. You have to jettison biblical sexual ethics. Period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts for Kendi. So that's one thing that just has to go. He said, well, apart from that, though, I can still embrace his way of thinking. Well, no, I pointed out there's all the false binary of racist versus anti-racist, and policy-wise, if you really go with his reasoning, they're already seeing, it's somewhat arguable, but people are claiming that the skyrocketing homicide rates in various cities are partially due to these terrible policies inspired by defund the police. There's skyrocketing homicide rates in various cities, and people are, again, I'm not sure if it's true, but it seems plausible. Look, if you tell police and take away police funding, police quit because they feel unsupported, and then you wonder why these crime rates are increasing, and tragically, a lot of the crimes falling on people of color living in poor urban areas. Mm-hmm. My point is, if you're thinking through that lens, well, I'm going to achieve equity by any, regardless of whether things are just and fair, without asking what are the causes of the inequity. Inequity is always caused by discrimination in Kendi's world. The point is you're going to end up hurting people. And we talked about in the last podcast about how the very notion that we can't achieve reconciliation without justice, that kind of idea, which Kendi would certainly buy into, is something we can't accept as a Christian church because we are brothers and sisters, period. And then generally speaking, and I know people will say, well, this is not really a worldview. It's not a religion. It's just like, but I'm looking at Kendi himself feels the spiritual pull of these ideas. And I really have seen so many people experience that pull and lose touch with the gospel that I can't ignore it. It really is a totalizing way to see the world. Mm-hmm. Not just in terms of race, gender, sexuality, power, authority. What is truth? We didn't get into the issue of how critical race theorists think about truth. Yeah. But my only point is, it's not as simple as saying, well, I'll have my Christian doctrine on one hand and I'll have my anti-racist practice on the other hand. Your doctrine informs your praxis and vice versa. And again, critical race theorists are very upfront about that. They want your whole heart. They don't want just your actions. They want to inform your thinking, and they want your thinking to inform your actions. So that's my caution to you, is that I've seen so many people go sideways on this. One example that is, I guess prominent for evangelicals, Michelle Higgins. So Michelle Higgins was she was a PCA, Presbyterian Church of America member in St. Louis, and 7 years ago now, 6 years ago, she gave a talk at Urbana, which is an InterVarsity's mission conference, evangelical missions conference. And in the talk, she said that Black Lives Matter is a movement on the mission and the truth of God. So she was a pro-Black Lives, and the worship team came out after her speech and put on Black Lives Matter T-shirts And she got a lot of flack for that sermon, right? People were saying, no, this Black Lives Matter is a problem. And I'm not going to go into that. The point is, though, at the time, people were like, no, she's a conservative Presbyterian in the PCA. She's Orthodox. This is very unfair. Well, just last year, and she was ordained as the senior pastor at a UCC church in St. Louis. It is a pro-choice congregation, and it is LGBTQ affirming. And a few Sundays ago, she preached on queer parenting, that we need to lean into the queerness of the Trinity. Okay? That's where she is today. And amazingly, she is still doing a podcast called Truth's Table with two evangelical co-hosts, Ekemini Yuan and Christina Cleveland, who are both still, I guess, conservative evangelicals, and you're embracing her as like a sister in Christ. But her theology, I mean, man, she's totally abandoned any pretense of evangelical theology. I mean, her organization, Faith for Justice, says on their website they promote Black liberation theology and womanist theology. It's just outright. It's not like, no, they're not evangelical at all. Wow. My only point is this. I don't see that as a fluke. She is simply following the reasoning and the underlying premises and the underlying worldview of this movement. And I worry that other people have followed her. So that's my warning. And it's not accidental. If you follow the fundamental tenets of these critical race theory to their logical conclusions, that is where you will land theologically. So that's my warning. And the big thing, too, is that there are better ways to do this. My friend George Yancey, a Black evangelical sociologist at Baylor, he wrote a great book called Beyond Racial Gridlock years ago. He has a new one coming out. It's actually arguing that color blindness and anti-racism are both bad solutions to our racial problems, and he proposes a different solution based, probably given his other work, on active listening, on dialogue, on consensus building. And his last book I read, I loved it. It's called Beyond Racial Gridlock. It really emphasizes the problem is that we're sinners. That's our fundamental problem. We're sinners who found redemption in Christ, and that has to be the basis for our unity across racial lines. So anyway, if you are looking for a way to pursue racial unity, to fight racism, my plea to you is there are better ways. You don't have to embrace essentially an unbiblical, godless ideology in order to do that. There are conservative believers who would love to work with you, guide you, help you out, and they're open to us. So please, learn from them and not from Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah. Well, that was powerful, Neil, and it's just it's such an encouraging thing to know that there are Christians out there, such as yourself, and using the giftedness that God has given you and the passion, because you and I know, again, being biracial people, where I'm getting more of these conversations now where people say, hey, let's talk to Jason, he's a Mexican. I'm like, I think just because I'm Mexican doesn't mean I can talk about these racial disparities, or you know what I mean, and you guys feel more comfortable now, or they go get a black friend or an Indian friend or Chinese friend. But in some cases we're kind of seeing that become more of the case, and it's good to see that these people who come from these different ethnic backgrounds, they're actually speaking into it and they're educated on it, because, we would say a few years back, predominantly you're getting, like, no offense, but the white Southern Baptist preacher talking about it. You know what I mean? So it's kind of cool to see more of this engagement with different ethnic groups. So I appreciate that. And hopefully this has been an encouraging thing for a lot of the people listening. Last thing, just quick little word. How can people go deeper into this discussion and follow you?
Yeah, so again, my Twitter handle is at Neil Shenvi, NeilShenvi, and you can follow me on Twitter. I post updates on my talks, presentations, new articles on my website, whatever I'm reading at the time, so that's one way to follow me. And then I have a website. You just Google Neil Shenvi, you'll find it. It's shenviapologetics.com, but I am easy to find on Google. So follow me there, and I've done lots of these presentations and interviews, and I've done book reviews, and so they're all there on my website. So if you go there, you'll find a lot to chew on. But yeah, I just want to encourage people. I'm not up here. If you look at my talks, I will say I give the whole sections of my talk are devoted to slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, the evils of slavery, of racism, the existence of present day racism and its effects. So I'm not trying to ignore this issue. I really am not. I'm trying to prevent us from taking a wrong turn and seeking a solution that is no solution at all, that will actually undermine the church and worsen race relations rather than healing our racial relationships. So I just want to emphasize that. I'm not here to silence people. I'm here to point people in hopefully a more biblical direction.
Well, that's good, man. And so I hope people check those things out. I hope this video has been encouraging. Neil, once again, thank you for being on the show.
Great. Thanks, Jason.
Well, my friends, that's going to do it here on Challenging Conversations with Jason Jimenez. Thank you to just all of the people out there who are watching the show and taking time to embrace the stuff that Neil and I are talking about. And so I want to make sure that you guys understand that this is an ongoing conversation. We're not to criticize or judge people or condemn people, but rather instead, we are to make sure that we're to love people in Christ. As always, you can go to my website, standstrongministries.org. You can click on the book section to get my book, Challenging Conversations, to help you engage these kind of conversations that Neil was talking about, whether it be CRT, anti-racism, politics, sexual sins, whatever. That's available for you guys. Thank you guys for checking this podcast out. You can go to edify.app to download the app so you can get shows just like this one. Until next time, my friends, keep standing strong.